Welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. I'm your host, Beth Pilgreen, and as of January 1st, 2020, marijuana is now legal for adults over the age of 21 in 11 states. It's legal for medical use in 33 states, and those numbers continue to grow. Now, for many Americans, 67% of them, according to a recent Pew poll, that's welcomed news. But regardless of public opinion or the politics of it all, one thing has been made very clear, and that's the fact that the process of state legalization has been positively exhausting for anyone working in human resources. It wasn't that long ago that HR's directives regarding marijuana use in the workplace were simple. Either employers tested or they didn't. And if they did, and a test came back positive, well, it was grounds for firing. But today, things aren't so simple. While both possession and use of marijuana are still illegal under federal law, rapid-fire legalization on the state level has meant that HR pros practically have to check their morning papers to see what's legal in their state. And when legalization happens, regardless of whether it's recreational or medicinal, what happens to workplace drug policies? Happily, we have Lisa Nagele-Piazza here with us to help sort all of this out. Lisa is the senior legal editor at SHRM, and she's been following these changing laws and how they affect HR for several years now. Lisa, we are thrilled that you're here with us.
Well, thanks, Beth. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so in the introduction, I mentioned drug testing. This past January, you released a 3-part series on workplace drug testing for the SHRM website. And that seems like the perfect place to start. So let's do that. Given that there's scattered marijuana legalization throughout the country, is drug testing even worth doing anymore, in your opinion?
And the standard legal answer applies here as it usually does, and that is, it depends.
Yes, that's great.
It's really complicated, and it's going to depend on not just state law, but it's going to depend on the needs of the business as well. Are there safety sensitive positions? What is the culture like? Are people going to be turned off from applying for jobs at this company if they do drug test? And so it really is a case by case consideration for employers. And they might even want to think about, do they want to test for just safety sensitive jobs and maybe not for traditional office jobs? So there's a lot to think about.
I think the general public, that they might appreciate that also for the safety sensitive jobs specifically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I know. I
Hello.
certainly don't want anyone who's operating heavy equipment or driving a vehicle under the influence. I don't think anybody does. So certainly there's a strong interest for those safety sensitive positions to continue to test.
Right, right. Well, you mentioned in your article on the SHRM website that some employers still screen for other drugs, but in light of the changing laws, some have stopped screening for marijuana. How common is that, do you think?
It's really hard to say. And I'm not sure if maybe companies are just dropping drug testing altogether. I looked at Quest Diagnostics, which performs drug screens, and they collect a lot of data on the topic. And according to Quest's website in 2019, nearly 98% of all non-regulated drug tests that they performed still included marijuana in the panel. So it might be that more employers are just considering it an all or nothing, but they do have the option to take marijuana testing out of that 5-test panel if they so choose.
Is that 98%? Is that countrywide?
I believe so.
That's surprising, isn't it?
It really
With the
is.
11 states that we mentioned, I mean, that being legalized, that's really surprising to me.
And now that's just of those employers that do continue to test. It doesn't really reflect how many employers have stopped testing altogether.
And is that, to your knowledge, is that a large percentage too, that people have just stopped testing?
What I've been hearing anecdotally is that employers are not testing anymore. Statistically, I don't really know what that number is, but
Sure.
yeah, but that's definitely what the dialogue is. And I think that a lot of HR professionals right now are talking about, should we test, or, talking about why they stopped testing altogether. And a lot of that comes down to, the struggle to find talent and the cultural acceptance of marijuana use. And so all of that is sort of changing the way that employers are looking at their drug testing policies.
Okay, so let's say that they do still test, if a company chooses to test, when do they do it and how often do they typically do it?
That's a good question. And the most common time to drug test is pre-employment. And I think that employers see that as a little bit easier because the person doesn't work for them yet. And at least in theory, it's somewhat easy to just say, okay, you failed a drug test. We're not going to hire you. And
Yeah, it's a
so,
great screening policy, right? Hey, this isn't going to work. Sorry.
yeah, and so so that's what employers are doing. You fail the drug test, we're not going to hire you. And a lot of employers may decide not to follow up with additional testing throughout employment, but some do. And so you might have random drug testing, and you'll find that mostly in those highly safety sensitive positions, maybe on
Hmm.
construction sites and in industries like that, where it's just a pool of employees and their names are randomly selected for drug testing every so often. There's also post accident, and that's pretty much self-explanatory that when an accident happens, the people involved in the accident will be
Oh,
tested,
yeah,
and employers should really focus on testing those employees who could have contributed to the incident, not just maybe bystanders and whatnot.
sure. Because at that point, they're trying to build their case with all the data they can as to contributing factors, I'm sure.
Sure, absolutely. And employers want to be careful not to have a blanket policy after
Hmm.
an incident where testing everyone. Like I said, you
Hmm.
don't want to test those bystanders because you don't want to discourage people from coming forward to report an incident. So, really, you just want to see if the forklift driver injured somebody while driving the forklift, we test the forklift driver. But we're not going to test the person perhaps who was injured. It depends on the circumstances,
Sure.
but certainly post accident is a time when employers are going to want to see if drug use has contributed. And then there's also reasonable suspicion as well. So when observable behaviors cause a manager to think that somebody might be under the influence, that's a time that employers may want to test as well for safety
That is my
reasons.
next question, you psychic lady. Can you explain the concept of reasonable suspicion of impairment?
Absolutely. So, reasonable suspicion is just as it sounds, that if an employee is exhibiting behaviors that lead a manager to think that that employee is under the influence, that triggers a drug test. So, observable behaviors might be a strong odor, although with marijuana that's
Hmm.
changing now, considering the use of edibles as well as vape pens that don't have the traditional odor that smoking marijuana has. But also there's movements, maybe staggering, twitching, watery red eyes, and confused facial expressions, slurred speech, all of those kind of things. A lot the same as when you're testing for alcohol as well. When you're looking at somebody who might be drunk, you're looking at kind of the same things, same behaviors.
Sure. Yeah. How much does cost play in whether or not a company chooses to test? Is that expensive?
It's definitely going to be a factor. Drug testing can be very expensive, and particularly for companies with smaller staffing budgets, when we're talking about pre-employment screening,
Hmm.
it can get to be costly because it's recommended that employers include a medical review process, because you're going to want to have somebody with medical knowledge. So you're going to outsource to a drug screening company, and they're going to analyze the test. They're going to know if there are certain levels that might be in somebody's system from eating poppy seed bagels or something like that, that
Oh,
they might
yeah. I
say,
remember that.
or from secondhand smoke. People sometimes have those excuses when they fail a test, and the drug screening company is going to be able to discern that type of use or intake compared to an actual user. So
Oh, that's
it's
good.
definitely recommended that an employer use a medical review process. That's going to help too, that the reviewer can actually ask follow-up questions if something comes up positive. Maybe there's an explanation for it.
Hmm.
Employers want to be careful that they don't run afoul of the Americans with Disabilities Act or any state disability laws. And so all of that is going to be considered by the medical review process. And so, getting to your original question, that can get expensive.
All of that can get expensive. Yes, sounds like it. Well, I'm curious if you think that drug testing impacts an employer's brand. Like, for example, are Gen Z job candidates, people who have maybe grown up in an environment where marijuana is legal to some extent, do you think they are put off by companies that still test?
It's something that employers should consider. As you mentioned, nearly 67% of Americans who have been surveyed on this actually favor legalization now, and that's a pretty high number considering that in the 60s that number was 12% in 1969, according to Gallup. So there's
Wow.
way more people are in favor of legalizing marijuana now than in the past, and so you have to think that that the younger generations probably don't view marijuana use in the same way as seasoned professionals might. So definitely thinking about people new coming into the workforce. Culture is going to have an impact on whether or not they want to work somewhere, and that is something that employers have to consider. Again, it's always balanced with safety. So if the
Sure.
employer has highly safety sensitive positions, then that is going to override the cultural aspects of the negative impressions of drug testing. So it all depends on the company, the culture, and the jobs that they have, what their branding is, how they're trying to attract
Sure.
and retain employees. But
Hmm.
it's always something to consider.
Okay, so let me ask you this. If an employee tests positive for marijuana, say in a state that has legalized both medicinal and recreational use, what happens then? Is there a certain process that they go through? Like, what are the ramifications of that?
This is where it gets really complicated and is going to depend on state law. So,
Hmm.
as you mentioned, marijuana use, whether it's medical or recreational, is still illegal under federal law. And a lot of state laws have taken different approaches. So, for example, the really interesting thing to me is that, and it might be surprising to some people, that under California law, there is no protection for no job protection for medical use. So under California law, there's no job protection for medical use of marijuana.
That is
And
so surprising.
isn't it? And I
Yeah.
think that the reason is because California was the first state to pass to
Oh.
legalize. California was the first state to legalize medical use in 1996. So at that
Oh.
time, the law was really very narrow. And since more states have been passing these laws have provided broader protections. So in
Oh.
some states, it's written in the statute that there are certain job protections. So in some state laws, there are specific protections for medical marijuana card holders. That's registered users that have followed the process under state law to obtain a card to use or purchase medical marijuana, and that counts for their caretakers as well. So it's covered under, because generally, if somebody is eligible for a medical marijuana card, then they have an underlying disability that they're using the marijuana to treat.
Hmm.
So they're covered under the state disability law for their use. It doesn't mean a really important thing for employers to understand. And this is step one. And, just to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Step one is for employers to recognize that on the job intoxication never has to be tolerated. However, there may be protection based on the status as a card holder. So you can't just have a blanket policy that says, in some states, you can't just have a blanket policy that says, we're not hiring anyone who uses marijuana. We don't care if it's medical or recreational. If you fail the pre-employment drug test, if you test positive for marijuana, we're not going to hire you. That's not going to be acceptable in some states. In other states, it still is. So it really comes
Yeah.
down to knowing the law in the states in which you operate. And if you're in a state that has legalized medicinal or recreational, every state that has legalized recreational has also legalized medicinal, but not necessarily the other way around. So if you're in a state that has legalized marijuana, you want to know what, if any, job protections
Yeah.
are in the law itself or how courts have interpreted the law to have job protections. And that's probably time to call the lawyer too if you want to take an adverse employment
Sure.
action based on a positive test in a state that has legalized marijuana.
Okay, are there situations though where a medical user might face the same penalties that a recreational user might face if they test positive at work?
Some states have special protections just for medical marijuana users that are registered with the state that don't apply to recreational users. Other states, even where marijuana use is legal, don't have any job protections for either medicinal or recreational users. You really have to look to that state law. And now, for example, there's a new trend. Nevada, a law went into effect in January that saying that employers cannot take a pre-employment positive marijuana test into consideration in the hiring process.
Really? The whole state of Nevada passed that?
Yes. And
Interesting.
New York City has a similar law that is going to take effect later this year, just saying that employers can't test for marijuana pre-employment.
Hmm.
So the laws are stated a little differently. In Nevada, the employer cannot use a pre-employment marijuana test against an applicant. And in New York City, employers will no longer be able to test pre-employment for marijuana. That's not to say they can't test post-accident or when they have a reasonable suspicion for
Sure.
current employees. I also have to clarify, it's very
Yep.
important to say that both the Nevada law and the New York City law have exceptions for safety sensitive positions and
Good.
positions that require drug testing under federal law, for example, by the Department of Transportation.
That would be a really important one to note.
And that's always true. If under federal law, certain positions are required to, if employees are required to undergo drug testing under federal law, that's always going to hold up under state law.
Okay, so where do you think the responsibility for keeping up with all of this falls? Is that, in your opinion, I would assume it falls under the individual, but do you think that that's HR responsibility, or are companies taking a more collaborative approach to educate employees where this applies?
I think the collaborative approach is always best. So the HR department, the legal department are going to be involved. But beyond that, it's really about senior leadership, thinking about their branding, the safety needs of the organization, their culture, how they attract and retain employees, all of that. So it's really a collaborative effort. And beyond that, supervisors can really provide insight into the realities for their departments. And they also need to know how to spot impairment and be trained on what to do if someone is impaired. So there are definitely a lot of people involved in creating and shaping the workplace policies and procedures.
Well, that's good. It does seem very confusing as a whole, and I'm glad that you are there in your position to help sort things out with people that need it, because there's so many, as we've been saying, variables. But my question for you next is, what do you think the challenges are for companies with multiple locations in different states? Some of the states being legalized and some not. I'm assuming they're just going to have just separate policies per state, and they can't really have a company-wide group of rules.
Well, I think that employers do have to decide if they want to have different laws in different states and just kind of comply with each one individually, which can get pretty complicated. It's already complicated enough, I think, when you're just
Mm-hmm.
considering one state law. Yeah, that's really when the decision comes in. Are we going to drug test at all? Are we just going to focus on reasonable suspicion? How are we going to approach it from the bigger picture, and then maybe breaking it down to looking at the nuances of each state law in the places they operate? It's also important to note, you had asked me about what happens if somebody fails a drug test. Well,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to the marijuana statutes, there's also drug testing laws. So beyond just what is in the marijuana law, employers have to follow very specific procedures in some states when employees or job applicants fail a drug test. So they have to go through that process as well. There might be a notice period. There might be a period that they have to give the job applicant or employee to respond, to challenge, to retest. There are a lot of considerations that may be different from state to state as well.
And that's probably a great collaboration with legal and HR, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Got to have a checklist down, I'm sure. All right. Well, we are going to take a sponsorship break right now, but we are just getting started. When we return, we'll talk about on the job impairment and employer responses. So stick with us. Hi, thanks for listening. And also thanks to Proofbox for supporting this week's episode of Project HR. Proofbox is like Netflix for labor relations. Every video, every resource, immediately at your fingertips. Instantly stream the employee communication titles you need and allow members of your leadership team to do the same. Learn more at unionproof.com/proofbox. We are back with Lisa Nagele-Piazza, Senior Legal Editor for SHRM. Lisa, so let's shift focus from drug testing to the day-to-day working in a location where legalization to some extent has happened. What are the changes for a company and what impacts do those changes have on their HR staff?
Employers are going to have to keep up with the changing laws in their area. There is a lot of misinformation out there and misconceptions. So, a big part of HR's role is going to be communicating the company's position to employees and really making them understand how the changing laws in their location have impacted their policies and procedures. It's probably a good idea in places where there are no job protections for any marijuana use for employers to let employees know that if they are going to drug test and if they are going to enforce drug-free workplace policies, then they should make that clear that although marijuana use is now legal in the state, we still want to maintain a drug-free workplace, and here's how we are going to do that. So setting expectations with employees, I think, is very important, and that communication can come from HR. And just as far as the misinformation and misconceptions, as I mentioned before, I think it's very important just to make clear to employers that on the job intoxication does not have to be tolerated.
Well, that kind of brings me to my next question, because earlier we mentioned on-the-job impairment, and I know that that is such a fear, specifically with these safety-sensitive roles, like air traffic controllers, surgeons, for example. I wanted you to just place clarification here. Can employers with jobs like that in legalized states where, let's say, medical and recreational use are both legalized, but can employers still require that these certain positions that we've mentioned be sober at work 100% of the time?
It comes down to safety first.
Right.
So there's always a risk in every decision that employers make, and there's no guarantee that they're not going to get sued. But employers have to kind of balance the risk. And okay, marijuana use is legal. Maybe there are some job protections out there, but we have safety sensitive positions, and safety is the most important thing to us. We're going to continue to screen, and we're going to make employment decisions based on those screens. And employers can take that stance, and they just have to balance the risk there.
What are some typical accommodations with this that you've seen?
That's a really great question. And it's super important for employers to understand that not only under state statutes, but also under some court decisions, some recent ones, courts have been interpreting marijuana laws and state disability laws to provide protections to medical marijuana users. So that means that employers should be engaging in an interactive dialogue with employees to see if a reasonable accommodation can be made to a medical marijuana user. And that doesn't mean, again, I'll say it over and over again, that doesn't mean that the employer's accommodation has to be, you can be high at work. That's not what the courts are saying. That's not what the lawmakers are saying. But it does mean that the employer should make a good faith effort to figure out if there is an accommodation, which might be a shift change so that the employee can use marijuana for medicinal purposes on their own time, off duty. Maybe the reasonable accommodation is giving the employee a leave of absence during the time that the employee needs to use cannabis.
Okay. And what happens if an employee refuses a reasonable accommodation?
The employer does not have to necessarily accept the accommodation that the employee offers. So the most important part is that good faith effort, that dialogue with the employee to see if there's a workable solution for the employee and the employer. If at the end of that dialogue, the employer reasonably concludes that there isn't an accommodation, then the employer can go through the process to figure out what the next steps are.
Okay, so far we've been talking about marijuana specifically, but what about the use of CBD products? Should companies include those in their drug policies as well?
And that sort of opens up a whole other can of worms because CBD products are, first of all, let me explain what that means.
Hmm.
So, the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana is referred to as THC. CBD is a non psychoactive component. So that means it doesn't get you high. And it has also been pinpointed as having medicinal value. So there are some products that strictly use CBD, and low THC or CBD products are actually legal in most states. But it gets complicated because it's not highly regulated. It's a little bit difficult to tell if an employee would test positive for THC if they're using a CBD product. So,
Right.
um, it does get very complicated. But generally, CBD oil is considered to not have this psychoactive component. And so, as far as policies go, that sort of comes down to, again, what employers want to test for. Do they want to have a zero tolerance policy? And maybe they do want to consider just focusing on reasonable suspicion, because
Hmm.
if it's a product that is readily available in most states that does not have a psychoactive component that is said to not get somebody high, then those observable behaviors in theory wouldn't be there.
Hmm. And there are so many companies out there right now making CBD products.
Right, absolutely.
Also, I thought that CBD was legal in every state. It is actually illegal in some states.
There are a few states that just don't have a law regarding low THC products.
Oh, got it.
So, off the top of my head, I believe that Idaho is one of those states,
Oh, interesting. Okay, cool.
but there are very few.
Well, Lisa, it's time now for a very quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. Today's guest is Lisa Nagele-Piazza, Senior Legal Editor for SHRM, and our topic is the impact of changing marijuana laws on HR. We are back. Well, these changing laws have spawned some legal challenges over the years, some resulting in some employer friendly decisions and some favoring employees. Are there any notable cases that HR professionals should be familiar with?
Absolutely. So some of the earlier cases that tested this issue came out in favor of the employer. One of the more famous cases was a Colorado Supreme Court decision. It's Coates v. Dish Network, where an employee was partially paralyzed in a car accident, and he used medicinal marijuana in compliance with state law off duty, but he was terminated for testing positive and violating a zero tolerance policy. Now, in Colorado, the state Supreme Court came out in favor of the employer.
Oh.
And that was pretty much focused on, all marijuana being illegal under federal law. So,
Mm.
other courts, however, more recently have interpreted the laws a little bit differently. So, for example, there was a case in Massachusetts. There was a case tested by the Massachusetts High Court, and the court said that a job applicant who was a registered medical marijuana user and whose job offer was rescinded because of that status for failing a pre-employment drug test, she could move forward with her case that her job offer was rescinded in violation of state law. So
Mm.
it's really, courts have come out in different ways on this topic. Employers want to have that interactive dialogue so that if there is an accommodation available, that perhaps they can provide that. They should know that just having a blanket policy isn't going to be acceptable in every state.
You've obviously been watching this and seeing the laws change over the years and been writing about these issues for a while. Where do you see this all going? Like, let's just say, as a country, do you see more legalization happening in more states? And do you
Yes.
see further changes for HR as a result?
Yes, absolutely. I think that we are going to continue to see more states legalize marijuana use, both medicinally and for recreational use. And in fact, even the governor of New York recently said that that is a priority to legalize recreational use in New York, and that he is committed to working with neighboring states to come up with comprehensive plans for legalization. So I think that's one trend that we're going to see.
Yeah,
Another
definitely.
one is I think more states and cities are going to follow the direction of Nevada and New York City and start putting limitations on the use of a failed marijuana test for pre-employment testing.
Well, what advice do you have for HR pros when dealing with the issue of medical or recreational marijuana in the workplace? What should they have in place right now, and how should they prepare for the future and these ever-changing laws?
The most important thing is to think before you react. Don't make an off the cuff decision. If someone fails a drug test, take a look at the law, take a look at the company's policies, make sure you're applying them consistently, and also know when it's time to contact your lawyer, either
Mm-hmm.
in-house or your law firm that you use to get some legal advice on how to move forward. Because as you can see here, it can get very challenging to comply. It's complicated, and just consistency is important. And also, you can no longer create a drug testing policy and just kind of push it off to the side, give it to employees during new hire orientation. It has to be constantly reviewed and updated as necessary, both for changes in the law and for changes in corporate culture, for all of those things. So the policy has to be updated regularly.
Sure. Yeah, it seems like everything is changing regularly. So yeah, we need to keep up too.
Absolutely.
Well, Lisa, if you don't mind me asking, with your position right now with SHRM, what are you working on right now?
I mostly cover state and local laws, so
Mm-hmm.
it keeps me very busy to try to, keep up with everything that's going on in terms of workplace law. And there are a lot of big changes, as we've been talking about, with marijuana and drug testing. And I'm just following the other state law trends as well on paid family leave and paid sick leave, all those kind of things.
All that fun stuff.
All that fun stuff, all those things that keeps HR, engaged.
Yes, definitely. Well, I really appreciate talking to you and learning about what you do and the complications of what you do. And I just appreciate your expertise in this area. So thank you for talking with us today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Of course. And just for everyone who's listening, links to Lisa's author page at SHRM, which includes all of her writing on this topic and so many others, will be included in this episode's companion guide. So be sure to sign up for it at projectionsinc.com/podcast and take some time to go read her work because it is so insightful. But guys, don't go anywhere yet because the interview isn't over. Lisa, now it's time for our lightning round questions. And these questions are questions we ask every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, topic showdown. In this episode, we discussed changing marijuana laws and how they affect HR. In the spirit of that discussion, and in your opinion, which is the best of these 80s era anti-drug slogans? Just say no, or this is your brain on drugs?
As a child of the 80s, I have these vivid memories of my Saturday morning cartoons being interrupted with the fried egg being cracked on the pan and sizzling, and hearing,
me too.
"This is your brain on drugs." So I think I would go with that. I'll never get that one out of my head.
Same. I vividly remember those commercials. What is the worst job interview question you've ever been asked?
It's really funny, but I can't think of a terrible job interview question that I have been asked. And I think the reason is because I have pretty much always worked in human resources or employment law. And so the people who are interviewing me are pretty skilled, seasoned interviewers, and they know how to keep it job related.
Hey, that's positive. That's good. What is your favorite thing about working in HR?
I love HR. HR is my first love. And even though I went into law and am writing now, I have never taken my HR hat off. And that's because nearly everyone works or relies on employment in some way. And I just love being a part of a field that really focuses on making workplaces better for everyone.
That's a great answer. How pleasant. What is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Don't be afraid to stretch. The more you stretch, the more you get out of your comfort zone, the bigger your comfort zone gets.
Oh, brilliant. Who or what inspires you?
I get inspired mostly by traveling the world. I actually just got back this weekend from Guatemala, and
What part?
I was in Guatemala City, Antigua, and Lake
Oh.
Atitlan, and it was extraordinary, beautiful. And so I'm inspired by people around the world, cultures, and the way that we're all the same and maybe just a little bit different, and getting to know people.
Oh my gosh, we are the same. First of all, I love Antigua and I love Lake Atitlan. I've been there as well.
Oh, nice. Oh, it was so beautiful.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much again for joining me on this week's episode of Project HR.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thanks again to our listeners as well. Don't forget to grab the companion for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. And if you'd like to be on Project HR or know someone who would, feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. Finally, we'd love for you to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. Your ratings help more people find us online, so thanks for helping us get the word out. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.